There is a darkness in humanity that has manifested itself in a lust for blood throughout the ages. The Old Testament and ancient myths catalog murder and revenge as part of the fabric of life in ancient times. Cain slew Abel. Romulus slew Remus. Unleashing the beast within is a possibility for all of us. The decision to kill from passion or premeditation has often defined our world, past, present, and future. Wars have terrorized entire populations for thousands of years. The American West was home to ruthless killers who were idolized in fiction and folklore. Evil evolved to a hideous new form with the genocidal dictators of the 20th century, such as Hitler, Stalin, and Mao Zedong, who ordered the death of tens of millions. But in the middle of the 20th century, a new and chilling phenomenon emerged in post-war Western society: the serial killer. As if fashioned from our nightmares, they terrify and fascinate us. Lurking behind masks of bland normality, they often evade capture for years, decades, or eternity. They are America's serial killers.
We killed her. We dumped her body off, and that was it. Nothing to it.
Every year in this country, we have about 20 serial killers, 10 of whom are apprehended, 10 of whom are on the loose. And they are, in total, responsible for some 200 deaths. So 200 victims of serial killers on a yearly basis. And what makes this particularly important for us is that the average serial killer is responsible for 10 deaths. That's a huge body count.
America's Serial Killers, Portraits in Evil, will strip the covers from a world of profiling and forensic science as we expose America's most brutal serial killers. In the late 1960s and into the 1970s, the United States of America was quickly becoming the serial killer capital of the world. And while the Zodiac Killer was terrifying San Francisco, and the Son of Sam haunted New York City, another kind of serial killer in the nation's heartland set his sights on a different kind of victim: boys and young men.
There are these instances where murderers who clearly have struggled with sexual orientation issues, typically gay men, bisexual men, have murdered sexual partners. And, this is all speculation. But I do think that sometimes murdering the sexual partner is an effort on the part of the murderer to struggle with his own sexual orientation, his own ambivalence about his sexual orientation. On the one hand, he may feel compelled to engage in a gay relationship, and at the very same time, feel repulsed by his own homosexuality, and sufficiently angry that he feels the need to murder the evidence of his own homosexuality. That this is this own internal struggle that in these extreme cases results in a murder.
The first and most notorious to fit this bill was John Wayne Gacy, aka the Clown Killer.
John Wayne Gacy made the strong affirmation that he was not gay when he was caught. He told the police he was bisexual. He wanted everybody to know it. He was not gay.
This overtly macho man with the name John Wayne would kill at least 33 young men and boys between the age of 15 and 21.
Most serial killers are heterosexual, and they target members of the opposite gender. John Wayne Gacy, by contrast, was a homosexually oriented serial murderer. But I think the interesting thing about him was how well liked he was in the Chicago area. He was a big shot in local Democratic politics. He had his photograph taken with Rosalind Carter, who at that time was Jimmy Carter's first lady in the White House. He had been voted JC Man of the Year. He owned a construction company that employed a lot of the victims that he ultimately killed. And the fact that he killed at home in one locale, burying 29 of the 33 bodies in the crawl space under his single-family home in Des Plaines, indicates something about serial killers that we don't often think of, and that is that most of them do not cross jurisdictional boundaries.
John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago, Illinois on March 17, 1942. And like most serial killers, he had a troubled youth.
John Gacy apparently had a very overbearing father, a dominating father. They make a lot of the fact that he would disappear into his basement, after, drunkenly raging upon the family. He would then disappear into a basement to which the children were not allowed. But essentially, Gacy was a man who lived in his day-to-day life as sexually straight. He had a wife, he had children. He was a known person in his community. He dressed as a clown and did children's parties and things of this nature. Yet he obviously had within him not only the violent desire to control and murder people, but he controlled and murdered boys. His homosexual nature of his crimes was in stark contrast to his day-to-day life, where he lived as a straight man and an upright model of the community. But he apparently used the lure of kind of a party, like, hey, in my basement you can watch porno movies, you can smoke pot, you can get drunk even though you're not old enough. And he apparently had something that he called the handcuff trick, where he would show that he had this trick pair of handcuffs and he'd put them on and then show how they came off. And then he would either switch the handcuffs to a different pair or use the same pair but not share the trick of how to get off them, put them on, and once he had control of the victim, he gave in to the darkest of inner demons and tortured his victims apparently at length and over an extended period of time before killing them and then ultimately depositing them in his basement with lime as well to hasten the decomposition of their bodies.
Typical of a blossoming serial killer, Gacy's perverted behavior surfaced in his mid-20s. He was prosecuted for sodomizing 2 teenage boys in Waterloo, Iowa in 1968. He probably committed more criminal acts for which he wasn't caught. After 2 years in prison, he was paroled and moved back to Chicago, where, hidden from his friends, family, and social community, he continued his perverted actions, sodomizing young boys. Then, in 1975, he crossed over the line and began killing. Chose to kill, knowing full well that it was wrong. His targets were young men and boys who have been defined by criminologists as the quote-unquote less dead. Men and women who live on the fringes of society. People who, if killed, would not be missed. In Gacy's case, young male prostitutes and homeless runaways.
There was actually a reporter in Chicago who had connections within the gay community, and there was talk amongst the gay community, the prostitute community at least, that awful lot of boys were going missing without, being known. And in fact, there was a case of one boy who had been taken to Gacy's house. He had played the handcuff trick on him. He choked him. He had repeatedly forced his head underwater in a bathtub and then let him breathe and then put him back underwater almost to death. And then for reasons known only to Gacy, he let him go. And this young fellow remembered the type of car that the rapist had and sort of what the exit looked like that he got off the highway. And his family waited there at that exit, waiting for someone to come who had a car that looked like what he said the car looked like. They found it. They followed him to his house. They reported it to the police. The police came. They investigated, but did not believe the boy's story. And Gacy was able to continue his activities for several years.
But like many serial killers, John Wayne Gacy became cocky and overconfident.
He had abducted a boy who had just left a drugstore where he'd picked up some photographs that had been developed. When the boy disappeared, Gacy's name came up. Gacy had some record. He did have a record of having, of some sexual crimes, and so that was a red flag for the cops. They came to his house, they searched his house, and they found the ticket for those photographs. And so they knew that the boy had been in his house.
He was pretty bold in the way he committed his killings. He seemed to think that if he put lye down there, no one was going to smell the dead bodies deteriorating. And basically that was his fallibility, because a police officer who had been actually having dinner with Gacy had been playing a game because he'd been under surveillance for a long time after a lieutenant in the Des Plaines Police Department had taken more time with this missing persons case because his boy was the same age as the boy who was missing. And they had had him under surveillance for a long time, and Gacy just invited him up for supper. So they went. And he couldn't get this feeling of smelling something, and he didn't know what it was. And for days he couldn't figure it out. And it finally dawned on him it was autopsy smell. So that's when they got a warrant based on police officer's nose, and Gacy was done right then and there.
The Gacy case was so incredible, killing and burying 30 young victims right in his own home. So terrible and so sensational that serial killers began gaining celebrity status, almost lionized as anti-heroes.
And when he was finally apprehended and he was on death row, he painted portraits of himself as a clown. And after death, these portraits, which are, by the way, at the level of paint by numbers and wouldn't be worth more than $1 or $2 if he hadn't killed 33 people, are now on sale for $3,000 each. And there are plenty of people who have bought them.
But John Wayne Gacy was anything but an anti-hero. He was no more than a pathetic man who chose to kill again and again.
Here's a guy who killed 33 people in Des Plaines, Illinois. He doesn't deserve to be seen as an anti-hero. He doesn't deserve to be glamorized by Hollywood. He's a monster, nothing more, nothing less, and that's the way he deserves to be treated. We have glamorized and romanticized these serial killers, and the message has not been lost on our young people. There are many high school students out there, or even middle school students, who are being bullied and harassed on a daily basis at school, or maybe they're just being ignored and they want a little attention. They want to feel important. They want to feel good about themselves. And when we glamorize serial killers, the message is all too clear. You want to make the cover of a celebrity magazine. You want your image on a t-shirt. You want to be the subject of a popular motion picture. Kill somebody. Oh, and while you're at it, kill a lot of people. The larger your body count, the more likely you are to be glamorized. That is the wrong message to give our youngsters.
In the 1931 movie M, the first movie about serial killing, the victims were innocent children. Nothing is more horrifying than the killing and brutalization of children.
A person who engages in serial murder being essentially weak themselves in their lives, in their existence. They feel weak and they have this need to exercise power. It's interesting if you're thinking about killing children because it's much easier to exercise power over a child than it is an adult. It may be that the killers who target children are in fact within themselves have a weaker constitution and they are afraid to exercise power over more powerful people.
Early on, Albert Fish, also known as the Vampire of Brooklyn, killed and cannibalized children in the late 1920s in New York City. And H.H. Holmes, who may have killed hundreds during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, killed 3 children as part of his confidence schemes. But serial killers whose victims were children were a rare phenomenon in America until the 1970s.
The serial killer is involved in killing more children today than he has been in the past. I'm using he generally. And one of the reasons is that based upon the research of child abductions, stranger abductions, we have a pretty good idea that there is a very large percentage of kids who are abducted by strangers are going to be dead within 2 or 3 hours. Then you have to go back and think how long it takes a guardian or a parent to find out the child is missing and report it to the police. So frequently the police have a very narrow window to find this kid. And of course, with the laws changing on pedophiles, with the law changing on homicide in a number of jurisdictions, you know, they don't want that kid to be alive. They don't want a witness. So they're going to kill him or her. And I think that's happening more today than it has in the past.
The 1979 to 1981 case that changed the face of serial killing one more time was the Atlanta child murder case. The perpetrator, Wayne Williams, was a homosexual pedophile who was black. His case was different because most American serial killers up to this time were white men, whether gay or straight. The child murders began when the bodies of 2 boys were found in Atlanta, Georgia. One was 14, the other 13. One had been shot, the other was suffocated. Both were black. For the next year and a half, more than 20 innocent black boys ranging in age from 9 to 16 were reported missing by their anxious parents, only to turn up dead. Most had been asphyxiated as a result of strangulation. By the summer of 1980, the Atlanta black community was in a state of terror. Many blacks at the time believed the murderers had to be from white cults, such as the Ku Klux Klan. However, law officials knew it would be impossible for a white man to enter the black community and abduct so many black children without being noticed. It had to be a black gay man. That man turned out to be Wayne Williams, also known as the Atlanta child murderer. Wayne Williams was born in 1958 to a well-to-do black Atlanta family. At the time the murders began, He was a 21-year-old aspiring music promoter, working at a radio station while still living at home. Williams became a suspect in May 1981 when cops were running surveillance on a known body dump site along Atlanta's Chattahoochee River. Williams' car was spotted on a bridge directly above the sound of a loud splash heard by the stakeout team. Stopped by police and questioned, he claimed he was going out of town to audition a young singer. Police caught him lying, but he remained a suspect, taunting the police who kept him under surveillance. 3 days later, the nude body of 27-year-old Nathaniel Cater, who had been missing for days, turned up in the river. The medical examiner on the case ruled Cater had died of asphyxiation. Police theorized that Williams had killed Cater and had thrown him off the bridge the night they pulled him over. Williams failed a polygraph test, and hairs and fibers on one of the victims' bodies were found consistent with those from Williams' home, car, and dog. He was arrested on June 21, 1981 for the murder of Cater and the earlier killing of 29-year-old Jimmy Payne. Ironically, Williams was convicted for the murder of 2 adults. But after his trial, police declared an additional 23 of the 29 child murders solved. Like most serial murder cases, there are always people who will insist on the innocence of the convicted perpetrator. Such has been true with Wayne Williams.
It is very difficult for us to believe that one human being could have inflicted so much death. It's hard for us to believe that anyone is a serial killer. Once a serial killer is apprehended, convicted, serving his sentence, it is almost always the case that many people will say he was innocent. Wayne Williams killed perhaps 22, maybe even 28 young people in the Atlanta area. To this day, there are so many who say he's totally innocent. Maybe he is innocent of some of those crimes, and maybe not.
The John Wayne Gacy case, the case of a homosexual man killing over 30 boys and young men, then burying them in his basement, was so horrendous, so sensational, it led many people and true crime aficionados to speculate that the combination of serial killing and homosexuality was a common phenomenon.
There are not as many gay serial killers as people are led to believe. There are a fair number of gay killers who bring the victims back to their home on a pretense. Of course, Dahmer brought them back on a pretense to pay them for photographing them in the nude. There have been other gay serial killers, but they don't generally pick up gay prostitutes on the streets. They're more involved, they get more involved with their victims than, say, someone who would pick up a prostitute just on the street or grab a stranger they don't know. They want to get more involved with the victim. Certainly Dahmer wanted to get very involved with his victim. He wanted to stick around forever. So it's a bit different in terms of the gay killings.
2 gay serial killers broke this mold, did not get to know their victims, did not spend so-called normal time with them, as did Gacy and Milwaukee's Jeffrey Dahmer. They were William Bonin and Randy Kraft, aka the Highway Killers.
Each serial murderer has their own reasons, their own psychological need to kill. You have a guy like Randy Kraft, for example, who was a serial killer in California in the late 70s and early 80s. Here's a man who, by all accounts, drove incessantly, continually at night, driving hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles on the highways. For a person like this, I think the difference in time between his crimes had less to do with being sated sexually or psychologically and more to do with opportunity. His eyes were open as he drove around for the opportunity to pick up a hitchhiking boy. He killed young men. His desire was there pretty much continually, but he knew that there were only certain circumstances that he could control, and until those circumstances were in place, he would just keep driving.
In this way, Randy Kraft was like a straight male serial killer.
It would be so easy to give some highfalutin psychiatric explanation for the choice of victims of serial killers. He hated his mother, and all of these women remind him of her. His mother was a prostitute, so he decided to kill lots of hookers. Well, maybe and maybe not. More likely, victims are selected based on accessibility, convenience. Prostitutes are chosen so frequently because they'll get right into the car with the customer, in this case the killer, and then they're completely at his mercy. Not only that, but people are very slow to file missing person reports. There's no pressure on the police because middle-class women aren't being threatened, so they don't really care that much. The choice of a victim often has much more to do with accessibility and much less to do with some kind of psychiatric experience in the childhood of the killer. Old women living alone, street people, runaways, hitchhikers.
Unsuspecting male hitchhikers along the coastal highways in California and Oregon were Randy Kraft's victims. Kraft was born in California in 1945. As a kid, he was bright with an IQ over 130. He was admitted to the prestigious Claremont College. There, he joined the ROTC and was an enthusiastic supporter of Barry Goldwater in 1964. He graduated in 1968, but by this time, he was leading the gay life and becoming addicted to drugs. Indications are that he needed drugs or booze, needed to be high to do his killing. In 1969, Randy Kraft joined the Air Force. However, he was discharged 1 year later and, as a civilian, resumed his gay bar-hopping life. Then, at the age of 26 in 1971, Randy Kraft claimed his first victim, a 30-year-old gay bartender. There were several trademarks of his killings. The victims were frequently burned on their left nipple with an automobile cigarette lighter. Some of them had their left testicle cut out while they were alive. Some had objects shoved into their rectums. And of course, the use of drugs was common, usually Valium ingested with alcohol. The murders were truly horrific. In one instance, the victim's eyelids were cut off to prevent him from closing his eyes during the torture. For the next 12 years, Kraft's need to kill and torture was insatiable.
Randy Kraft was a gay man, lived as a gay man, had a long-term partner, but was convicted of killing a number of young men who he picked up as hitchhikers. His MO was to pick up perhaps a young Marine off on a weekend, and he would offer them, hey, I have some beers. You want a beer? Hey, I have some pot. How about some drugs? Do you want to do some drugs? He would either spike the beer with Valium or other tranquilizers, or he would just offer them as a means to continue the party. Once he had control of his victim, sometimes the victims were tortured to an extreme degree. emasculated, and he would then just dump the bodies out on the highway. He made very little effort, if any effort, to hide most of his victims, and would just dump them out on the side of the road as he drove. Just yet another indignity to perform. What's interesting about Kraft is that the police knew for a long time that they had more than one. They had what they called, I think, the highway killer.
That second homosexual serial killer was a man named William Bonin. From 1971 to 1978, dead men and boys were regularly found dumped along California's highways. Then, in 1979, there was a sudden explosion of dead male bodies beside the Los Angeles freeways. These were obviously the work of a homosexual serial killer. But the way these men were killed did not fit with the other mutilated bodies found earlier. This new frenzy of highway serial killing was the work of William Bonin, California's second highway homosexual serial killer. 2 years younger than Randy Kraft, he was born and raised in Connecticut. With a drunkard father and a frail mother, he ended up spending much of his time with his grandfather, a convicted child molester. Soon, William Bonin was doing this himself. After high school, he joined the military and distinguished himself in the Vietnam War. Returning home in 1969 at the age of 23, he resumed molesting young boys, for which he was arrested. By 1979, he was back on the streets living in LA. Resuming his molesting, he told a friend that he would never go to prison again because he would never leave a witness. For the next year, he raped and killed an estimated 40 young men and boys. Put under surveillance by the police, he was arrested for molesting a 15-year-old boy. Once in custody, he confessed to abducting, raping, and killing 21 young boys. For most people and the press, the capture of William Bonin heralded the end of the highway killings. But when the murders continued, the public was baffled. However, the police knew all along that there had been 2 killers. As is often the case, Randy Kraft was caught by dumb luck.
They had a task force in place for many, many years looking for Mr. Kraft and were unable to do so. But one night on a lonely stretch of highway, a couple of highway patrolmen saw a car weaving around. They pulled him over. The driver got out of the car and came back to them, which is, I think, a red flag for the police to think that there might be something going on in the car that the driver doesn't want them to know about. There was a young man in the front seat of the car who appeared asleep, but he wasn't asleep, he was dead. And not only was there a dead young man in his car, there were photographs of other young men who had turned up on the side of the road in the recent past in there, and perhaps most chilling, a list of, I believe, 60-some little memory triggers for him, little 1 or 2 or 3 word descriptions of various killings that he'd performed on this piece of paper. So he was convicted, I believe, of 11 murders, but the notion is that his list contained 60-plus entries and was perhaps even then not complete.
Randy Kraft and William Bonin were 2 of the most prolific serial killers of all time. With these 2 cases and their combined body count of over 100, law enforcement got a better understanding of the difference between a serial killer's MO, his modus operandi, and his signature, his perverted psychological need. William Bonin and Randy Kraft had the same MO, but different signatures.
Most people believe that MO, which stands for modus operandi, a Latin term, which means method of operation, is similar for each killer, each serial killer. In other words, they kill the same way all the time. It's not necessarily true. I can find killers who have strangled, who have used a knife, have burned victims, have dismembered victims. But you can look at other killers who have varied their method of killing. Now, one of the things they almost always don't change is their signature. Signature and MO are frequently confused. MO is just simply what it takes to do the job, what it takes to kill the person. A signature is something the killer does to meet his psychological needs. An extreme example I can think of a burglar who would break into a home during the day when people aren't there, find whatever he could in the way of jewels and merchandise, things he could fence, things he could sell. Then he would go to the refrigerator, make a sandwich, a glass of milk, and he'd sit at the kitchen table and have his lunch. Then before he left, he would defecate on the floor of the kitchen. Now that met his psychological need. Don't ask me what the need was, because I have no idea. I'm not a psychologist. I have no idea why he did that, but he did it consistently until he was caught. Serial killers may pose their bodies in the same fashion. They may dump, I hate to use that word, but dump their bodies, leave their bodies in a similar kind of a location every time. They're always, let's say they're always near water, or they're always near a cemetery, or whatever it might be. That would be the signature.
The only thing about Bonin that I think is different than with Kraft, they were both gay, they both killed young men. Bonin's, he was all about the raping of the victim, and then he just wanted to dispose of them. He was perhaps, for lack of a better term, perhaps more conventional a killer than Kraft, in that his motivation was the rape, but he also, as sort of an odd aside, involved several other people. He had more than one accomplice who on one time or another helped him kill some of his victims.
So, these two serial killers had different signatures. One got psychological gratification from raping and killing. The other got gratification from killing and mutilating. But their MOs were the same: targeting hitchhikers from a car and then dumping the bodies along the highway. A very different kind of highway serial killer is the case of Aileen Wuornos. Once again, here was a serial killer who broke psychologists' and law enforcement's common understanding as to what a killer was. This time, it was a gay woman prostitute who killed straight men in 1989 and 1990. The 2003 Hollywood blockbuster film Monster, starring Charlize Theron as Aileen Wuornos and Christina Ricci as her lesbian lover, romanticizes Wuornos' plight, making her into an anti-hero. Perhaps Eileen's first murder was self-defense. But the next 6 murders were calculated, cold-blooded killings. Men shot multiple times, their bodies dumped along Florida's highways. Wuornos declared,
"I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again, too. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again."
Homicide and serial killer detective Stephen Ainsworth sees these kinds of highway killings happening again.
There's a trend right now that a couple of patterns have been identified in the Midwest and back east where bodies are found along interstate highways, and it's suspected that it's probably a truck driver. But you know, things like that, and those kind of trends are being tracked right now. That seems to be the big thing since the Green River killer has been caught, the BTK killer has been done. Those are really the ones that are, I don't know if it's newsworthy, but those are probably the biggest trends right now.
What has happened to these gay serial killers? William Bonin, 16 years after his arrest, was the first person to be executed by lethal injection in the history of California. Eileen Wuornos was also put to death by lethal injection in 2002. Randy Kraft is still waiting for the needle on death row and can be contacted through his website. Wayne Williams is serving 2 consecutive life sentences, still claiming he is innocent. As for John Wayne Gacy, uttering his last words, "Kiss my ass," he too was put to death by lethal injection in 1994, but not before communicating with the public.
I wrote him a letter. I was sitting there at this desk and I said, well, I'll just write this guy a letter. And he sent me a letter which, you know, one of the things I mentioned in my letter was, you know, I guess the only reason I'm really writing is just because you'll write back and then I'll have this letter and I'll show my friends and we'll all go, ooh, you know. And, but the first thing he said in his letter was, so, you live in Arvada. That's just west of Denver off of I-70. Been a long time since I've been out that way. And you're like, ooh, creepola. But what I found really interesting in reading his letter, what ended up happening was I was writing an article for a local newspaper that I worked for, and they wanted an article on serial killers, which I wrote, and I subsequently sent to him, and he then wrote a review of it, which was great. That was kind of a little, you know, a really fun thing to be able to run. And one of the things that's about this man that I think is classic is he was extremely manipulative. In his letters, he was always talking about, you know, so, you know, what do you look like? You know, gosh, send me a picture. I'd really love to have a picture of you, you know, and all this other kind of stuff. It was pretty bizarre and interesting. I didn't send him a picture.